Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Forrest over here, and welcome back to another. Well, hold on, let me fix this. Fix this a bit better. There we go. I like it right here better. Anyway, uh, anyway, welcome to uh our next read on live stream. Now, you guys may notice, Forrest. It seems to me like you're reading a third book. What's going on? Well, I won't say why I'm doing this. Recent history will tell you why. But if you know, you know. If you don't know, it's gonna you'll probably figure it out. If it's not too obvious currently, you'll most likely realize it or figure it out as time goes on. But there is a particular reason why I'm reading this book, which is Everything You Need to Ace U.S. History in one big fat notebook. And I intend on reading all of the books in this series to the most up-to-date thing. And on top of that, I'll be doing it with all the other books in this series, as well as one book that I'll be reading at the end. So this will be a once per week thing with this book, with this whole thing that I'm doing. Started with U.S. history because this is where everything started. Hence why I'm doing it. With that in mind, with that. So come along for the ride as we explore the ups and downs of American history, as is written in this big fat notebook. Let's see everything that took place. Right. Before we do, let's get some things straightened out as per the introduction to this book. Excuse me. Hi, these are the notes from my U.S. history class. Oh, who am I? Well, some people said I was the smartest kid in class. I wrote everything you need to ace U.S. history from the Ice Age to the Internet Age, and only the really important stuff in between. You know, the stuff that's usually on the test. I try to keep everything organized, so I almost always highlight vocabulary words in yellow, which I will explain the definition of what those words are that are highlighted in yellow. Color in definitions in green highlighter, which I'll also go over if it goes to that. Use blue pen for important people, places, dates, and terms. Doodle a pretty sweet Eleanor Roosevelt and whatnot to visually show the big ideas, as shown here. If you are not loving your textbook and you are not so great at taking notes in class, this notebook will help. It hits all the major points, but if your teacher spends a whole class talking about something that's not covered, go ahead and write that down for yourself. Now that I've aced U.S. history, this notebook is yours. I'm done with it. So this notebook's purpose in life is to help you learn and remember just what you need to ace your U.S. history class. Everything you need to ace U.S. history in one big fat notebook, second edition, has been updated to present a more accurate, inclusive recounting of historical events. Conscious language is used throughout to ensure a respectful tone when referring to people and their experiences. And that in Unit 10 has been updated to include the most recent key historical events. Yep, so as you can tell, there are going to be 10 units in this book. So there will be we'll be going over the history of the United States, for the next 10 weeks. 1 unit per week, because trust me, the pages are, it's going to sound a little bit small, but I think it's going to be interesting to do this. Also, before we begin with the first unit, it does point out here BCE equals before the Common Era, or before the year 1, and CE equals the Common Era, or the year 1 and after. BCE dates sort of work like negative numbers. For example, 1000 BCE is further in the past than 500 BCE. And year versus century. So how they got it pointed out is basically 1300s is the 14th century, 1400s 15th century, 1500s 16th century, 1600s 17th century, 1700s being the 18th century, 1800s being the 19th century, 1900s being the 20th century, and the 2000s being the 21st century. Unit 1, Prehistory to early 1600s. The United States is technically about 250 years old. But if you really want to understand all of what makes the nation unique, you have to travel much further back in time. Who lived on these lands first? How did they live? How did the first Europeans get here? And how did they treat the indigenous people of the continent? How was Africa swept into the nation's history? What kinds of conflicts were stirred up? Why is English the dominant language here? With so many questions, it is important to set the stage. The very beginning is a very good place to start. Chapter 1, Early People in America. Migration. People have been living in the Americas much longer than scientists used to think. The first people started arriving around 38,000 BCE, before the Common Era, which starts with the year 1, 40,000 years ago. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers, communities of people. Now, nomadic hunter-gatherers are communities of people who move from place to place, relying on plants and animals found in the wild for food. They followed herds of the animals they hunted and ate the plants they found. Like the rest of humankind, they started out in Africa, but after thousands of years, they made their way east and north across Asia. When a group moves from one place to another, it's called a migration. Or, as the green box will put it out, the movement of a number of people or animals, often to establish a new homeland. The Ice Age and the Bering Land Bridge. These nomadic hunter-gatherers lived during the Ice Age, which took place during the most recent glacial period, when much of the earth was covered in ice and snow and entire oceans were frozen over. When seawater is frozen solid, the ocean level gets lower, exposing whole stretches of land that are underwater during warmer climates. The land connecting the northeast tip of Asia and present-day Alaska, called the Bering Land Bridge or Beringia, emerged. I said that completely messed up, but whatever. According to the land bridge theory, nomadic hunter-gatherers crossed on this land bridge from Asia into North America, what is now Alaska, most likely in search of food. The Americas were filled with woolly mammoths, mastodons, and other huge creatures. Just one could feed an entire nomad group for months. The land bridge theory is one of many theories. Scientists are still uncertain about this. And there's a map right here showing what they're talking about. And there's a little picture right there, so that's fun. The theory says that people kept crossing until around 10,500 BCE, when the Ice Age, which had lasted about 100,000 years, finally ended. The oceans rose and covered the Bering Land Bridge, cutting off further migrations from Asia. Ice Age animals died off or were hunted into extinction. These animals were replaced by smaller animals that could thrive in warmer weather, changing people's diets and lifestyles. Some nomad societies, which is a group of people living together as a group, stayed in Alaska, while others continued south through Central and South America and the rest of North America. As societies spread, they developed individual cultures and traditions and sometimes different physical traits. Also, a culture is the way a society behaves and its system of beliefs, laws, and customs. Also, it should be noted here that we have on the left page right here, we have this big map. Mesoamerican civilizations. You have Mesoamerica, which is the area now called Central America. You have the Olmec, which lived in Mesoamerica 1200 to 400 BCE. Then you had the Maya, Mesoamerica 300 BCE to 900 CE. Aztec, Mexico, 1110 to 1521 CE, capital Tenochtitlan, and Inca, South America, 1100 to 1533 CE, capital Cuzco, Cuzco, not spelled like the emperor from the Emperor's New Groove. Anyway, settling down. When agriculture developed, many societies stopped being nomadic. They changed their focus to planting seeds and farming foods like beans, squash, and maize, an early form of corn. These societies cultivated diverse strains of corn, beans, and squash, and created enough food to nourish the entire continent. They settled down, built permanent homes, formed villages, and invented advanced technologies like irrigation systems and canals that helped make their daily lives more productive. One of the first great civilizations, an advanced and complicated society, was the Olmec Society, which flourished around 1200 BCE on the coast of Mesoamerica when small groups began to band together. The Olmecs were skilled people with an extensive knowledge of the land. Their expertise enabled them to grow enough food to feed thousands of people. They were also known for harnessing the skills of their large population to create giant stone sculptures and pyramids. Around 400 BCE, the Olmecs disappeared. No one knows why. Famine, war, and natural disaster are all possibilities. Around this time, the Maya civilization developed in the Mesoamerican rainforest. As the Olmecs disappeared, Maya cities grew. The Maya were also skilled in farming and building, raising crops, and constructing huge pyramids and temples. They had a theocracy, worshipped the sun, stars, and moon, and developed a 365-day calendar. In other words, theocracy is a rule by gods, government where the priests are in charge. They built canals and a large trade network, which helped them grow into a powerful civilization. Mayans used forced labor to achieve much of their greatness. By around 900 CE, their power and influence had greatly diminished, and they ultimately fell because of rebellions from the enslaved and the working class. The Aztecs, who began as warriors and hunters, conquered what is now central Mexico around 1100 CE. In 1325, they founded their capital, Tenochtitlan, on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. They used advanced engineering skills to build bridges to connect their capital to the mainland, making Tenochtitlan one of the largest cities in the world. As the Aztecs continued to conquer, using some of their prisoners as human sacrifices. By the 1500s, they were a powerful empire, which is a powerful political unit made up of a number of territories under a single rule. The Incas started as small groups in the Andes Mountains. Around 1100 CE, they founded their capital Cuzco in what is now Peru. A powerful government united them into a population of about 12 million people, all speaking the common language of Quechua, which today is the most commonly spoken indigenous language in the Americas, with speakers throughout the Andes, Colombia, Ecuador, and elsewhere. The Inca's innovations included terraced farming, a network of roads, and the use of knotted strings, called, also called quipu, with record keeping. They built cities such as Machu Picchu for their religious ceremonies. Remember the order in which the first empires rose and fell on with this mnemonic device. O Olmec, my Maya, America's Aztec, interesting Inca. So, oh my, America's interesting, it would represent Olmec, Maya, Aztec, and Inca, respectively. In the 1500s, the Aztec and Inca civilizations were invaded and colonized by Spanish conquistadors, which led to their downfall. We're not going to do the questions and answers things that they have at the end of each chapter. We're just going to read the chapters itself. We're moving on. Hey, Daniel Barry, how you doing tonight? Chapter 2, Indigenous Peoples in America. The millions of people who formed complex communities and who originally settled in the land that is now the U.S. and Canada are called indigenous peoples, aka people who are native to an area. Early indigenous peoples. Around 12,000 BCE, the ancestral Pueblo people, called the Anasazi by Anglo-American historians, settled in the Four Corners area. The map is on the next page. We'll look at that later. Their first homes were pit houses, dwellings dug partly into the ground. By about 750 CE, they were building pueblos, multi-storied apartment-like buildings made from adobe and other local materials. Adobe is a kind of clay still used for building in the Southwest. The Pueblo people were also known for cliff dwellings built along cliff walls and mountainsides. For religious rites, they created cave-like underground ceremonial chambers called kivas. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Pueblo people were astute farmers. Since the Four Corners area was relatively dry, they devised irrigation techniques to grow crops, especially maize. The Pueblo people inhabited the area until around 1300 CE, when they split into hundreds of smaller city-states along the Rio Grande and that traded with each other, some of them becoming major trade centers. There was prosperity, and their descendants still live in the region and practice the culture. Historians still don't know why they split up. Also, the Four Corners, for those of you that don't know what that is. Basically, it's the place where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. So basically, where you see those arrows. Moving on. The Hugugam, also known as Hohokam, lived in present-day Arizona. They arrived from Mexico around the year 300 CE and stayed for about a millennium. The Hugugam had the most extensive and advanced irrigation system in the world at the time, and their community connected North and Central America, making it a major trading crossroads in the Americas. The Mound Builder societies created huge earthen mounds as temples and burial sites that can still be seen in the central United States. The first were built around 1000 BCE and echo the look of Mesoamerican pyramids. It's a clue that mound builders may have come from Mesoamerica. The mound builders were the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian peoples. The Adena hunter-gatherers thrived around 800 BCE. The Hopewell were farmers and traders at their height around 200 to 500 BCE. When the Hopewell population declined around the year 700 BCE, 700 CE, come on, Forrest, but your year's right, the Mississippian people became the more widespread. Around 900 CE, they formed their largest settlement, Cahokia, located in present-day Illinois. Cahokia was home to tens of thousands of people and was the site of the Mississippian people's largest mound, Monkstown. Monkstown, which is 100 feet high, still stands in Collinsville, Illinois. And this is what it looks like. Different societies from different environments. The North in present-day Alaska was so cold that the Inuits and Aleuts who settled there built igloos to protect themselves from the harsh weather. They relied on hunting and fishing. They were likely originally from Siberia and may have been the last migrants to cross the Bering Land Bridge. The Northwest had so many forests and such easy access to the ocean that the Tlingit, Haida, and Chinook who settled there used wood to build their houses and make totem poles with religious significance. Totem poles are poles created by Northwest Coast indigenous people by carving and painting representatives of ancestors or animal spirits on long pieces of wood. Fish, especially salmon, became their major food source. The West had such fertile land that the Ute, yeah, I completely mispronounced that, I'm sorry. The Ute and Shoshone tribes could live off abundant crops. These tribes formed small clans rather than large villages. The Southwest, the Southwest was home to descendants of ancestral Pueblo people, the Hopi, the Acoma, and the Zuni, who continued to build with adobe and grow maize. Around the 1500s, two nomadic hunter-gatherer societies arrived, the Apache and the Navajo, also called the Daine. Within a century, they had built villages too. The Great Plains were filled with herds of buffalo or bison, so the people there became nomads and hunters. The Blackfeet and the Apache lived in teepees or conical tents that were easy to follow the bison. Starting in the 1500s, some tribes, like the Comanche and Dakota, used horses that had escaped from Spanish explorers and became famous for their equestrian skills. The Southeast had rich soil from its rivers and mountains, and the Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Salagi, called the Cherokee by Anglo-American historians, farmed and built permanent villages around their fields. Many indigenous groups maintain their cultural traditions today. Also, before we continue on, the Northeast was teeming with forests, so groups such as the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee tended to be hunters and traders and farmers, and they lived in long houses made of wood. This map tells you every single thing about each group and where they are pointed to on the map. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. The Haudenosaunee wait, wait. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, called the Iroquois Confederacy by the French and the League of Five Nations by the English, refers to a powerful alliance between five indigenous nations living in what's now upstate New York: the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Seneca, the Mohawk, and the Oneida. Each nation of the Confederacy had a distinct language and culture, but they were governed together by the great law of peace, which inspired the later U.S. Constitution, a set of rules that all nations followed. Representatives from each nation formed the Grand Council, which governed and settled disputes. They had a communal food supply and ensured that crops were shared equally among all people. They also used discussions, we call it diplomacy today, instead of warfare to settle disputes. In 1722, the Tuscarora people joined in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy today. Wait, hold on, I missed a word there. Let me rephrase that. Let me repeat that sentence. In 1722, the Tuscarora people joined in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy today is made up of 6 nations. Use this mnemonic device to remember the 5 original nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is Cosmo, Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, Mohawk, Oneida. Chapter 3: The Price of Expansion. Contact, Conflict, Conquest, and Colonization. Some called this period the Age of Exploration, and there was a lot of exploring going on. But this explanation by people living in Europe also led to the explanation of the original inhabitants of the other 3 continents bordering the Atlantic Ocean: North America, South America, and Africa. The Age of Exploration led the 4 continents that frame the Atlantic Ocean into contact, conflict, conquest, and colonization. Colonization is the process of settling and establishing control over land and the indigenous people settled on that land. What about the Vikings? The Vikings, seafaring people from Scandinavia, were the first Europeans to explore North America. Eric the Red discovered Greenland, and his son Leif Erikson reached present-day Canada in the year 1000 CE. Erikson named the land Vinland, but since the Vikings didn't stay, future explorers were credited with being the first Europeans. Motive and means to travel and trade. What does trading have to do with U.S. history? A lot, it turns out, actually. Europeans fell in love with trade goods from Asia after the Crusades of the 12th century and the travels of Marco Polo in the 13th century. Should also be noted, the Crusades were 9 military expeditions by Christian European nations to win control of holy sites from the Muslim nations, who also considered the sites holy. These events introduced Europeans to the 4 S's: spices, silk, scents, and precious stones. Traders used caravan routes in the Silk Road, a network of trading routes that linked China and the West to move goods. Trade over land was difficult, and after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottoman Empire cut off access to those essential trade routes. The appetite for Asian goods was the motivation for Europeans to find other ways to get the items they wanted. So Europeans worked on the means to get Asia by sailing. The Portuguese took the lead in sailing the seas, mostly because of Prince Henry the Navigator. He built a school of navigation in the 1400s. The school used Arab boats as a model to develop the caravel, a speedy and maneuverable ship that could sail into the wind, making it easier to explore coastlines. Making it easier to explore coastlines. I should have said that better. Magnetic compasses invented in China improved the safety and efficiency of ocean travel. Astrolabes allowed sailors to figure out their location in the ocean by measuring the distance of the sun and stars, like an ancient GPS. Sailors figured out that the North Atlantic Current moves clockwise between Europe and the Caribbean, and the South Atlantic Current travels counterclockwise between Africa and South America. This saved them from being randomly swept out to sea. Sometimes that's how they discovered new places. Sometimes that's how they disappeared forever. The Portuguese used this knowledge to explore the west coast of Africa, called the Gold Coast, where they traded with Arab and African merchants for good, ivory, and enslaved people. The West African slave trade rose. By the 1400s, West Africa's largest kingdoms had fractured into many small kingdoms that warred over land and trade. Enslaving captured enemies was an established practice, and a slave trade was a big and terrible part of the West African economy. When the Portuguese and other Europeans arrived in the 1480s, they saw Western Africa as a source of enslaved labor that they could profit from and utilize in their new colonies. Europeans established ports along with the African coast and raided towns, capturing as many African adults and children as they could. The more Europeans explored and colonized, the bigger the slave trade grew. European expeditions. 1487. A storm and winds accidentally took Bartholomew Diaz to the southern tip of Africa. Diaz named the land the Cape of Good Hope, in the hope that it would lead to a route to India. 1492. Christopher Columbus thought he could reach India faster if he sailed west. 1493 or 97. Da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in May 1498. The Portuguese made this a regular trade route, and Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, became a major trade city, which made Portugal very rich. Also in 1497, John Cabot, aka Giovanni Caboto, was an Italian navigator who explored the North Atlantic for England's Henry VII. He brought back stirring reports of fishing grounds where the fish practically jumped into their boat. A third thing in 1497, a Portuguese fleet led by Pedro Alvares Cabral ended up in present-day Brazil while on the way to Africa, so Cabral claimed the land for Portugal. 1502, Amerigo Vespucci sailed along the coast of South America. He was one of the first Europeans to realize for sure that these lands were not in Asia. A German mapmaker labeled these new lands America in his honor. 1513. Ponce de Leon was the first European to set foot in Florida, looking for the fountain of youth. 1513. Vasco Nunes de Balboa crossed Panama and was the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the west. 1519. Ferdinand Magellan, sailing on behalf of Spain, reached the tip of South America. He was killed in battle in the Philippines, but his ships and sailors, who returned to Spain in 1522, were the first Europeans to circumnavigate the earth. Also, Ferdinand Magellan also coined the name Pacific Ocean from peaceful sea. 1519. Hernandez Cortez explored Mexico. Also, it says here circumnavigate means to sail around. Which is circumvent circle. Anyway, 1522. Francisco Pizarro explored the Andes. 1524. Giovanni da Verrazzano, an Italian sent by the French, explored Nova Scotia, Canada. 1528. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca was stranded on an island off the coast of what is now Texas. He and three other survivors, two Spanish sailors and an enslaved African, made their way to Spanish settlements in northern Mexico. Cabeza de Vaca came to respect the many indigenous societies he met along the way. 1535. Jacques Cartier, a Frenchman, explored the St. Lawrence River and claimed what is now Canada for France. 1539. Hernando de Soto explored North America and in 1541 crossed the Mississippi River. 1540. Francisco Coronado traveled overland seeking the seven cities of gold in modern day New Mexico. Even has a little small cartoon there of a boat of a ship at sea saying, "Are we there yet?" Conflict between countries, drawing the line of demarcation. Immediately, there was conflict between Spain and Portugal over their claims to lands. In 1493, they asked Pope Alexander VI to settle their argument. On a map of the world, the Pope drew a line of demarcation from the top to the bottom, declaring that everything to the west belonged to Spain and everything to the east belonged, both times in quotation marks, to Portugal. They didn't acknowledge that the land already belonged to the millions of people who had lived on it for centuries. Go figure. A year later, the two countries agreed to move the line about 1,175 miles west in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Spain was given almost all of the American continents except Brazil, which is why Portuguese, not Spanish, is spoken in Brazil now, and some islands in the Atlantic. In other words, looks like that. Conquest and colonization, the conquistadors. During the 16th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese came into contact and conflict with indigenous populations. But the Spanish created a system of conquest and colonization that proved very effective. It was so effective, they even had a special name for the men who did this work: conquistadors. The conquistadors were given permission from the king and queen to settle in the Americas in return for 20% of any treasure they seized in the area. This was known as the King's Fifth. The Spanish had already learned that these lands were rich in mineral resources, and they were preparing to take as much as they could manage. Basically, long story short, that picture right here basically explains it. You have you have five different sets of stuff. That which has what looks to be the crown is the king's share. The conquistadors wanted to convert people to Christianity, trade for goods, and, of course, find lots of gold. Now for the one person that has been, who up until a number of years ago was celebrated, and now instead of it being Christopher Columbus Day, it is now called Indigenous Peoples Day. Christopher Columbus. We had to get to him a little at some point, right? Christopher Columbus sailed for Spain and set the stage for the Spanish conquistadors. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus set out with three ships: the Pinta, both caravels, and the flagship Santa Maria. 2 months later, Columbus's team landed on the Bahamian island of Guanahani, uh, Guanahani, inhabited inhabited by the Taino people. Columbus claimed the land for Spain and called it San Salvador. Though the Taino people were friendly to Columbus and his crew, The European settlers were more interested in gold and tobacco than in friendship. In general, they treated the indigenous people they encountered with extreme cruelty, enslaving them, forcing them to mine for gold, attacking and even killing them, and kidnapping around 1,500 people to enslave and sell in Europe. Columbus made three more voyages to the Caribbean. He explored Hispaniola, the island of present-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Jamaica, claiming the land for Spain. Once these Caribbean islands had been colonized, they were used as bases for the invasions of the nearby continents. And there's the old saying, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Columbus and his crew thought they were in the Indies in Asia, and this is why the Caribbean islands are called the West Indies, and why indigenous Americans were called Indians. From the islands to the inland empires. In 1518, Governor Diego Velázquez of the now settled colonial island of Cuba granted conquistador Hernan Cortes permission and several ships to explore the Yucatan Peninsula, 120 miles west of Cuba. Landing on Yucatan, Cortes saw the Maya pyramids for himself and met Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spaniard who'd been shipwrecked there for Hmm. I'm. Did I accidentally push a button or something? Hmm. Let me check something here real quick. I may have accidentally pressed something, but I want to check something real quick. I'm gonna mute my mic so I can hear this. Hold on a second. So, um, I see where it stopped on me. Uh, Let me check something here real quick. I'm gonna mute my mic so I know where exactly I'm at. Just give me a second. Okay, so I just figured out where I was at. Um, it's not. Thankfully, it's not too. Thankfully, it's not too far away from where I stopped when I noticed my mic wasn't working. I'm gonna go ahead and let this charge up for a few minutes. So we'll take a bit of a break. Uh, and then once this is ready, once I think we've got enough to last for the rest of the chapter, so I know where I'm at right now, we'll continue with where I left off. So for now, Just sit back, relax, talk amongst each other, look back to what I've read, and just have a nice little friendly conversation about the craziness that is the history of the United States, even though we're technically not quite there yet, because we're talking about other areas. Alright, so see you guys back here in a few minutes. Alright, I have returned. Let's go ahead and get back to this book. I'll have to keep a closer eye on my microphone from here on in. So that way I know when it's good and when it isn't. Alright. Getting back to this to that which we were on. So I'll start from the section that I was on when my microphone cut out. Alright? From the islands to the inland empires. In 1518, Governor Diego Velázquez of the now settled colonial island of Cuba granted Conquistador Hernan Cortes permission and several ships to explore the Yucatan Peninsula, 120 miles west of Cuba. Landing on the Yucatan, Cortes saw the Maya pyramids for himself and met Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spaniard who had been shipwrecked there for 7 years. Aguilar, fluent in Mayan and Spanish, became Cortes's translator. After a show of force in Potonchan, the indigenous peoples there gave the Spanish gifts, including 20 enslaved women. Among the enslaved was a young woman, Malintzin, aka La Malinche, who spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, a language spoken in central Mexico. These translators provided Cortes with a big advantage. By April 1519, Cortes met with a messenger of Montezuma, Emperor of the Mexica Empire, formerly called the Aztec Empire. Cortes showed off his horses, cannons, and guns, while the messenger told him about Mexico's capital city, Tenochtitlan. Now, before we go on with what was going on with Cortes, let's talk about this thing known as the Columbian Exchange. There had been no mixing of plants and animals between the Americas and the rest of the world for more than 10,000 years. Corn and potatoes found only in the Americas proved an absolute nutritional boom to Europe, whose population skyrocketed as a result. Europeans brought wheat, barley, grapes, and onions, as well as cattle, pigs, and horses to the Americas. The horse provided such an advantage that it was illegal to give or sell a horse to an indigenous person, but these laws failed to stop the spread of horses and horsemanship to many indigenous civilizations whose cultures were transformed by this new tool. European cows and pigs, however, were responsible for the destruction of many indigenous farm fields and often led to conflict. But hitchhikers also crossed the Atlantic. Dandelions and other weeds came in the sacks of seeds for planting, and germs came ashore on the backs of Europeans. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and the flu were common in Europe, but since people there had developed some immunity to them, they were increasingly less deadly to Europeans. Immunity in this situation meaning resistance to a disease or sickness, particularly due to previous exposure to the germs. But the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no such immunities. Soon these diseases were spreading through indigenous contact. Villages were wiped out by the smallpox. It is estimated that as much as 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas may have died as a result of these diseases. This mixing of plants, animals, viruses, and bacteria is known as the Columbian Exchange or the Great Biological Exchange. Back to Cortez. Cortez decided to attack the Mexica. He knew that many local tribes resented the Mexica, and he invited them to join the attack. If they resisted, he used violence to force them to work with him. When Cortes and his men got to Tenochtitlan, Montezuma offered the Spaniards treasures and hoped they'd leave. Instead, Cortes and his crew captured Montezuma, and tension grew. On June 30th, 1520, La Noche Triste, the Sand Night zone named by the Spanish, the people of Tenochtitlan drove the Spanish and their allies from the city. Montezuma was killed in the fighting, along with numerous Spanish soldiers. But in May 1521, as smallpox ravaged the city, Cortes returned with more Spanish troops, and this time Tenochtitlan was destroyed, and the Spanish built Mexico City on top of the rubble. Disease also helped the Spanish conquer the Inca Empire in modern day Peru. In 1528, Conquistador Francisco Pizarro sailed down the western coast of South America. He was gathering information about the wealth and strength of the Inca Empire. Returning to Spain with samples of Incan wealth, he received funding for an army to conquer the Incas. When Pizarro returned to the area in 1532 with 62 horsemen and 102 foot soldiers under his command, the Incan Empire was in the midst of a terrible civil war. Emperor Juan Huayna Capac had contracted smallpox and died shortly after. Pizarro's first visit had his son after Pizarro's first visit. His sons Atahualpa and Huascar fought over who would command the empire. Atahualpa welcomed Pizarro, but Pizarro took him prisoner. Atahu- Atahualpa offered excuse me. Atahualpa, Atahualpa offered the Spaniards gold in exchange for his freedom. Pizarro tried him for treason and executed him. Pizarro and his troops marched into the capital, Cuzco. By 1534, they had conquered the entire 2,000-mile long territory that made up the Inca Empire. Why did these powerful Mesoamerican empires fall to the Spanish? Three reasons. 1. The Spaniards' weapons, armor, and especially their horses were unfamiliar to the Mesoamericans, giving them a military edge. 2. The Spanish took advantage of local rivalries, encouraging or forcing indigenous tribes to fight each other. And big reason, European diseases like smallpox devastated the indigenous populations by as much as 90%, weakening their ability to defend themselves. Spanish society in the Americas. The Spanish colonies were under the control of the Spanish monarchs. They had two main missions. One, convert the indigenous population to Catholicism. Two, enrich the Spanish monarchy. Through the Council of the Indies, formed in 1524, the Spanish monarchs appointed two viceroys. Each was in charge of a viceroyalty, one in New Spain, aka Central America and its surroundings, and one in Peru. The monarchs got men to travel to the Americas by rewarding their settlers with encomiendas, or a royal grant of land that gave settlers the right to tax and enslave indigenous inhabitants. Remember that the king or queen got 20% of all profits earned. Most of the Spanish colonists were men, and it was common for them to form families with indigenous women, who by this time had been converted to Catholicism. The social hierarchy depended on race and birthplace. Land and positions of influence belonged to the Peninsulares from the peninsula of Spain. Although they were the smallest population, they held almost all the power. Creoles, the first generation born to Spanish parents, ranked below the Peninsulares. Mestizos of mixed European and indigenous parentage were next, then indigenous people, and then finally enslaved Africans. There were three main kinds of settlements: pueblos, which were towns and trading centers; missions, which focused on converting people to Christianity; and presidios, which were military forts. El Camino Real, the royal road from Mexico City to Santa Fe, connected many of these settlements. In and around the towns, had haciendas, large estates, and plantations, large farms raising cash crops, which was a plant that farmers grow to make money, grew coffee, cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Settlers also mined the abundance of mineral resources in the area, including gold and even more silver. These huge farm and mining operations required a lot of hard labor, and settlers used enslaved indigenous and African laborers to run them. Sugar and later tobacco became very profitable exports to Europe. Sugar was called white gold because it was so valuable. The Spanish got their foothold in central Mexico and the Andes, but they spread from there. In 1598, Juan de Olate established the province of New Mexico. He brought cows and horses and hundreds of settlers. The colony founded its capital city, Santa Fe, in 1607. Though the area was not as rich in resources as other areas, the same system of conversion, social hierarchies, and forced labor continued. Slavery in the early Americas. Sugar and tobacco plantations in South America and the Caribbean were highly profitable because colonizers used unpaid enslaved laborers. At first, the Spanish and Portuguese plantation owners primarily enslaved indigenous people, but because they had never been exposed to European diseases before, indigenous people died at very high rates, and because they were indigenous to the land when they ran away, they often successfully hid in the terrain. Yeah, so as this picture will show you right here, there's this picture here which says most sugar plantations were in the Caribbean at the time. Europeans called it the West Indies. Plantation owners decided they needed a different source of forced labor and began importing enslaved people from West Africa. Captive Africans were considered a better source of labor because they had a harder time running away. They were unfamiliar with the terrain, and they already had immunity to many diseases that killed indigenous people. Even so, making sure my light was still on. Even so, the terrible working conditions meant mortality rates were still high. Kidnapped Africans who landed in the Caribbean lived an average of only 3 years there. Bartolome de las Casas and the New Laws. Bartolome de las Casas was a priest who spoke and wrote about the mistreatment of the indigenous American population. He came to the Caribbean in 1502. His work contributed to the government of Spain passing the New Laws of 1542, making it illegal to enslave indigenous Americans. But that didn't end slavery. Because the Spanish could no longer enslave indigenous Americans, they instead enslaved more Africans. So it solved one problem with the indigenous peoples, but it basically made the situation with the Africans being uh, traded as slaves worse for them. Triangle trade. High death rates of enslaved workers meant that Spanish and Portuguese colonies and later English colonies along the east coast of North America imported enslaved people all the time and in huge numbers, leading to the growth of the West African slave trade. The slave trade was part of the triangular trade, a trade route with three Atlantic stops: the West African coast, the Sugar Islands of the West Indies, and the east coast of North America. So pretty much here's how it would go. So North America would send Ramanian to West Africa. West Africa would send enslaved people and gold to the West Indies, and the West Indies would send sugar and molasses to North America. The triangle trade was just one part of a larger exchange of goods and enslaved people that included Europe. For example, Europeans strictly controlled manufactured goods like glass and weapons to trade for raw materials like furs and sugar. African societies that wanted to maintain power over their neighbors needed manufactured weapons from Europe, which they paid for with captured Africans. Colonists in the West Indies and North America needed endless labor to fuel their plantations and bought it with rum and iron. The Middle Passage. The middle lane of the triangular trade, when ships left Africa filled with people whom they had either kidnapped or bought from kidnappers, was the Middle Passage. Because the purpose was to make a profit, the owners and captains of slave ships packed the Africans tightly together, like cargo, and provided little food for them. These conditions led to rampant disease. About 15% out of an estimated 9 to 12 million captive Africans died during the Middle Passage en route to the colonies. Although enslavers used this time to try to reshape independent people into submissive servants, Africans considered the passage a period of in-betweenness. Despite the enslavers deliberately filling ships with diverse peoples who did not speak the same languages, organized resistance often occurred. The captives used their voices, bodies, and even the ship's hulls to create music, a language that their captors did not understand. Uprisings were staged on board on about 10% of the voyages from Africa, often coordinated across tribal lines using this new language. Jumping overboard was another common act of defiance. This form of escape by which enslaved people would meet their ancestors in the afterlife was so common that many slave ships were equipped with nets to prevent it. Each European colonial power managed the resources and the labor within their empires, making the rules by which those newly established societies would operate successfully. Life in this new Atlantic world wasn't easy for anyone, but it proved devastating for indigenous peoples and Africans, whom the colonizing powers would continue to exploit for centuries. Hmm, wait a minute. Hold on a second. Okay, so we're actually on the final chapter for this unit. Chapter 4: The Atlantic World Opens. The Defeat of the Spanish Armada. It was clear to everyone in Europe that the Americas were extremely rich in resources and opportunity. The Spanish and the Portuguese dominated the Atlantic for the majority of the 16th century, but all that would change in 1588. The Dutch, the English, the French, and even the Swedish, ignoring the Catholic Pope's division of the so called New World, would soon explore and settle in the Americas as well as trade in Africa. The economic theory of mercantilism said that a nation's power was in its wealth. European countries competed more than ever to establish colonies to get raw materials and gain new markets for exports. Europeans were also fighting about religion. When Elizabeth I, a Protestant, became Queen of England in 1558, she ordered sailors to attack Spanish ships as they transported gold and silver back from America. She wanted to gain the wealth of the New World without incurring expen- the expense of having colonies. One of the most successful and daring of these English sailors was Sir Francis Drake. To the English, he was an adventurer. To the Spanish, he was a pirate. Motivated by these attacks and by his deep Catholic faith, in 1588 King Philip of Spain sent the mighty Spanish Armada a fleet of 130 ships to conquer England and force them back to Catholicism. The two navies met in the English Channel and England was the winner, with the help of a really massive storm. Spain never regained its previous power, and other nations saw they could challenge Spanish claims in the New World. That's gonna suck for them. A flurry of European settlement. Remember how the Spanish established Santa Fe in 1607? The same year, Englishmen settled Jamestown, Virginia. A year later, the French established Quebec, and 7 years after that, the Dutch settled the Hudson River Valley. All hoped to exploit the resources of the continent though how they planned to do that depended on where they were able to establish colonies, the resources they found there, the labor available, and who had power over the colony. They all encountered indigenous peoples, but forged their own unique relationships with them. By 1650, European countries were in fierce competition. Remember that the lands they claimed and the lands they actually settled weren't always the same. And remember that all of this claimed land was already inhabited by the indigenous people. Early English endeavors. In the late 1500s, explorer Sir Walter Raleigh received a charter, a permission from the monarch to start a colony. He sent an expedition in 1584 to settle land they'd call Virginia, after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. The next year, the expedition founded a colony on Roanoke Island in present-day North Carolina. Lack of food forced the settlers to sail back to England after a year. In 1587, a group of about 150 English settlers tried again in the same place. One of the leaders, John White, returned to England for supplies, but couldn't come back for 3 years because of the attack of the Spanish Armada. When he returned to Roanoke Island, the people had vanished. The first person born in the Americas to British parents, Virginia Dare, was John White's granddaughter. What happened to her and the other settlers is still a mystery. Her colony is now called the Lost Colony. Although the Roanoke colony failed, the English were determined. A group of merchants formed the Virginia Company of London to make money from the colonies. On April 26, 1607, approximately 125 settlers, all male, mostly in their 20s, reached the Chesapeake Bay and founded the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown, on the bank of the James River. The company and the settlers who decided to go were hoping for an experience similar to that of the Spanish, that lots of mineral wealth and forced indigenous labor would make them all rich. It was not to be. Now you may be wondering, what's with all the Jameses? After Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, James I became King of England. The settlers named Jamestown and the James River in his honor. The Jamestown settlers. Although Jamestown eventually survived, most of its first settlers were unprepared for what was to come. They settled on an island near the river because it could be a defensive position should anyone approached by water, but the water was dirty and undrinkable for most of the year. It was bitterly cold in winter, humid in summer, and full of disease carrying mosquitoes because of the marshy conditions. Most of the settlers were rich adventurers or explorers, not craftsmen or laborers, so they focused on searching for gold, of which there was little, instead of building houses or planting food. Fewer than half of the settlers survived the first winter. They owed their survival to the Powhatan Confederacy, a group of indigenous communities led by Chief Powhatan, who gave the settlers food and supplies and later taught them how to grow maize. The Starving Time. In 1608, Captain John Smith took charge of Jamestown, forcing settlers to plant and build, work or starve. Settlers spent more time searching for gold than farming, and they often raided Powhatan villages, stealing supplies, and sometimes burning homes and villages. The Powhatans responded in kind, and fighting escalated into the First Anglo-Powhatan War. In 1609, about 400 more settlers arrived, including women and children. That winter, disease and famine overtook the settlers. This period was called the Starving Time. People were so hungry they ate anything within reach, maybe even each other. Only about 60 settlers survived to spring. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in North America. The Spanish town of St. Augustine, Florida, remember explorer Ponce de Leon, was the first permanent Spanish settlement in North America. John Rolfe. In 1610, more settlers arrived, including John Rolfe, who was the first Jamestown settler to grow tobacco for export. A cash crop grown mainly in the West Indies, tobacco grew well in Virginia and made the settlement profitable for the first time. Settlers started planting tobacco, taking more land from the Powhatans, and prolonging the war between them. In 1614, Pocahontas, who was the ah, I don't know how far back it stopped, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna do what I did before. I'm gonna go out and do something so that way I can give this a bit of a charge because we are literally not too far away from. So I'm gonna let this charge up, and then I will return in a few minutes. I'm gonna try something out here. Let me see if you guys can hear me with this, with just this now, because somehow, if you guys can hear me, I somehow lost the fucking microphone that I was using. Let me check to make sure you guys can hear me though. Alright, you guys can hear me. So I'll go ahead and read the rest of the chapters with where we stopped at, which is about Pocahontas. Actually, go ahead and turn off my heater so you guys don't worry about that interrupting. Yep. So I'm gonna have to resort to using my cell phone camera, my iPhone microphone for the moment, because somehow I forgot. Well, I didn't forget. Somehow I. God damn it, Bear! Scare the shit out of me, dude. What? You alright over there? You alright? So I got my dog just made me jump. I don't know what he was barking at just now. Hopefully it was just a simple bark and nothing too serious. That's gonna be a clipping moment right there. Alright, we're continuing where we left off. That is a bit of a clipping moment though, so yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and restart that section that I was on before my microphone disconnected earlier, so let's finish this. John Rolfe. In 1610, more settlers arrived, including John Rolfe, who was the first Jamestown settler to grow tobacco for export. A cash crop grown mainly in the West Indies, tobacco grew well in Virginia and made the settlement profitable for the first time. Settlers started growing tobacco, taking more land from the Powhatans and prolonging the war between them. In 1614, Pocahontas, who was the daughter of Chief Powhatan and had been held captive by the settlers for almost 2 years, married John Rolfe, beginning an era of relative peace between the Powhatans and the Virginia settlers. Get your Johns straight. Don't listen to the legends. John Rolfe married Pocahontas. Although briefly captured by her father, John Smith may or may not have been rescued by Pocahontas. Most historians believe John Smith exaggerated or completely made up the story about the princess. Tobacco and the future of Virginia and the U.S. Despite the success of tobacco, the Virginia Company's poor track record in Virginia still made it hard to attract settlers to the colony. The company decided to bribe Englishmen to move there. Under the head right system, your right per head, meaning per person, any man who paid his way across the ocean was granted 50 acres of land in Virginia. Labor for the tobacco plantations was needed, so a system of indentured servitude was adopted. Indentured servitude, the condition of being a contracted laborer. Indentured servants, often from Britain or Germany, signed a contract for 4 to 7 years of service in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. Landowners who could afford to pay the passage of an indentured servant got 50 additional acres of land for each person, head, the indentured servant brought with him, including women and servants of his own. This labor system dominated the area for decades, and the first Africans arriving in Jamestown in 1619 were actually treated like indentured servants. After the time of the contract was up, indentured servants were given land and were free to make a new life. There was, however, one catch. About 50% of these servants died before they fulfilled their contracts because of abuse, poor nutrition, and hard labor. The French state claims. The French explored the St. Lawrence River as early as 1535, but the first settlements took some time to establish. In 1608, just a year after Santa Fe and the town were founded, French explorer Samuel de Champlain founded a trading post in Quebec, where an active fur and metal trade developed. The settlers who moved to New France were few and far between. So many men married indigenous women. That enabled them to build strong trading ties with the societies into which they had married. Although these settlers also brought European diseases, their small number and their need to get along with the many indigenous societies they encountered meant they had better relations with the indigenous population than either the Spanish or the English. They did not take over huge swaths of land for farming, the climate was not suited to it, but developed trading relationships with many groups. A number of Catholic priests also lived in New France, on a mission to convert the locals. As the French explored the inland waterways, they claimed large areas of territory, but never really settled it. In 1682, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, sailed the length of the Mississippi River and claimed the area, including what is now Louisiana, for the French when he reached the southern end. The French later founded a trading post there in what is now New Orleans. In the 1700s, the French established trading posts in present day Detroit, Michigan, and St. Louis, Missouri. Because of these French explorers, French culture in North America is still concentrated in the province of Quebec and the state of Louisiana. Yep. And the Dutch state claims too. The Dutch staked their claim in the Hudson River Valley. In 1609, Henry Hudson, an Englishman hired by the Dutch, had fully explored what is now known as the Hudson River. In 1614, they set up Fort Nassau, near modern-day Albany, at the location where the river becomes too small for larger ships. The Dutch West India Company established a colony of New Netherland in 1621 along the river. In 1626, Peter Minuit purchased the island of Manhattan from the indigenous Manhattans who occupied the island for what has been described as $24 worth of goods. It is likely that Manhattans did not consider this a sale of land. They probably considered the goods a gesture of goodwill or an offering to ensure hunting rights. Historians are uncertain if this was a misunderstanding due to language and cultural barriers or deliberate theft. The city of New Amsterdam, today's New York City, became a prosperous center of the fur trade and eventually the slave trade as well. The Dutch West India Company was a chartered company. In that kind of business, the investors joined to explore and trade together with the support of the government of their home country. The government also gave permission to negotiate with foreign leaders and own colonial land. The Dutch East India Company, which did business in India and Asia, was another chartered company. Ultimately, the Dutch, like the English, bribed settlers to come with the promise of land. Dutch families established farms the full length of the Hudson River. Yeah, I'm not going near that front door just in case somebody might be there. Hmm. Keep an eye on that back on that window just in case somebody might try to show up. Because at this point, I don't know. Because my dog just kind of freaked out a little bit. So, I'm keeping that door the window just in case. Nothing much. I pressed the wrong fucking button on my controller. Alright. And don't mess with me. Okay? If there is someone actually outside that window, please say something. Don't say there's a guy behind the window and then it turns out no, there isn't. Okay? Don't do that. Alright. We're going back to what I was reading. Act like nothing's happening. Let's see here. I'll just refer back to the paragraph I was reading before that happened. Ultimately, the Dutch, like the English, bribed settlers to come with the promise of land. Dutch families established farms the full length of the Hudson River. Taking land that was farmed and inhabited by the Esopus people caused conflict. The Dutch used diplomacy, violence, and trickery to get what they wanted from the local people. The French and the Dutch shared a common interest in furs, which created conflict between these traders and their indigenous allies. The French primarily traded with the St. Lawrence and Iroquoians, the Wyandot, Huron, and the Erie and the Susquehannock. These groups were historic enemies with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who conducted their trade with the Dutch. The competition for European trade resulted in a series of wars that lasted from 1609 to 1701 and was known as the Beaver Wars. The elusive Northwest Passage. Europeans had not given up on the idea of sailing west to get to Asia, and they were constantly exploring northern Canada, looking for a Northwest Passage. Remember John Cabot, the Giovanni Caboto, who found all the fish in 1497? In 1498, this Italian, sailing on behalf of England, landed in Newfoundland, Canada. Cabot thought he was in Asia, so he set sail for Japan, but he was never heard from again. Sorry, I couldn't resist doing that. A northwestern route to Asia is what Samuel de Champlain was seeking when he explored the St. Lawrence Seaway and founded Quebec. And Henry Hudson was hired by the Dutch to find a way through North America to the Pacific Ocean when he reached the Hudson River in 1609. The next year, he returned on behalf of the British and discovered a bay, Hudson Bay. He planned to go on, but his crew mutinied, and he was either lost at sea or more likely killed. A Northwest Passage wasn't navigated until 1903. Mutiny, to revolt or rebel against authority, especially by sailors against their officers. And that was Unit 1. Had a little bit of hiccups here and there, but, we ultimately got it done. Took them about 2 hours. But, like I said, we got it taken care of either way. So that is going to do it for me here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Force Walpole signing off.